So we're going to take a look at how the federal government functions and the powers as they're distributed between the national government and the states. And essentially just getting an overview of how the Constitution functions and powers were divided between the two. It's important to start off by saying that while we often talk about having three different systems of government in the United States, where we have a national government, state governments, and local governments, technically in the US Constitution, there is no discussion of local governments. Rather, that's one of the powers that's reserved to the states under the 10th Amendment, as we'll speak about in a couple of minutes. So really, the Constitution itself only talks about the relationship between the national government and the states. So in examining that, the first place that we would actually go, of course, is the US Constitution. So let's take a look at where we see the division of powers as far as it's concerned in the US Constitution. So here is the US Constitution, and as it's laid out, Article 1 talks about powers of Congress, Article 2 about powers of the President and the executive branch, Article 3 talks about powers related to the court system in the US at the federal level, and then the rest of it talks about power sharing and various other things. And then, of course, we get the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which are known as the Bill of Rights, which do have a number of important things related to federalism. So if we take a look at this and take a look at the powers delegated to the federal government, and we go down to Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution, what we essentially see is that there is a list here of 18 different functions that the federal government has the ability to be able to do. Lay and collect taxes, they have borrow money for the credit of the US, they have uniform role of naturalization, and on down the list as you can see here. So these 18 things within the context of Article 1, Section 8 are really the powers that are defined for the federal government to be able to do the job that they've been tasked with doing, right? Now, let me just mention here at this point in time, what the founders were really worried about when the Constitution was ratified. What we saw was that, down here, I do not have the amendments on here, was in Federalist number 84, if you read that by Alexander Hamilton, what we saw there was that there was a great concern among the anti-federalists that there wasn't some sort of declaration or Bill of Rights reserving powers to the people. And Hamilton comes along and says, well, the Constitution itself is a way to be able to limit the power of government. Therefore, we don't need this Bill of Rights or Declaration of Rights. But as we get the ratification of the Constitution, the first time Congress meets, they send out these amendments. There were more than 10 of them, but 10 of them became part of the Constitution. And one of those is the 10th Amendment. And that 10th Amendment reserves all powers not mentioned in the Constitution to the states, right? So theoretically, there should be a very clear system of dual federalism in the United States in which the federal government has certain powers and the state government has certain powers. But what we know is that it's a little bit less clear than that. So let's see some other things that are guaranteed in the Constitution between the state and national governments, and then talk a little bit about the idea of where states, federal government gets their powers. So within the context of later sections of the Constitution, there are a couple of obligations under the Constitution that the national government has to the states and a couple that the states have to the national government. First of all, because we give the power over the military to the federal government, it's the nation's obligation to protect us from foreign invasions. Second of all, there was some discussion about whether the original 13 states would have more power than new states, but they settled finally on the idea that we should have equal representation for every state in the United States Senate. Therefore, regardless of whether you're a new state or old state, every state gets 2 members of the US Senate. The territorial integrity of states is also guaranteed. What this means is that Congress or the federal government in some way, shape, or form cannot divide up states, for example. So California is an enormous state, has 54 members of the US Congress, the House of Representatives. It's got an enormous amount of influence on the federal government. there have been calls over the years to maybe split California into 3 separate states. That could potentially happen, but it could not happen without the consent of the state of California and the people of California. Meanwhile, they also can't decide that you just want to do away with the state. So say, for example, no offense to people in Delaware, but maybe they say, well, does Delaware really need to be its own state? What do you say we merge it with Maryland, or make it kind of a little southern appendage of Pennsylvania? That could theoretically be done, but it can't be done without the consent of the people of Delaware and the consent of the people either in Pennsylvania or Maryland where that would be merged into, right? So the territorial integrity is guaranteed in the Constitution of each state. There's only one state that's ever been divided up without its consent, and that was during the Civil War. Virginia obviously was on the side of the Confederacy, and the western portion of Virginia, which is a very different kind of terrain, very different kind of economic system than the plantation agricultural system in the rest of Virginia, wasn't particularly all that interested in joining the Confederacy, and President Lincoln made West Virginia into a state. So it's the only time that's ever happened. And the final thing that the national government has an obligation to provide for the states is that it guarantees it a Republican form of government, small r Republican. In other words, it guarantees that there are elected officials of some sort, and that there's a constitution, and that people have the ability to be able to participate in their governments. And that's been really kind of most relevant as new states have entered the Union, which of course we haven't had since 1959, so we don't speak too much of that right now. But it was a big thing during the 1800s as we kept admitting states, because they go back and forth sometimes between Congress and the states in an effort to be able to ensure that the constitutions of those states were small r Republican in form. And then finally, what are the state obligations to the national government? Well, one is that most of our elections are actually conducted through the states and through their local governments, usually through counties. So the federal government can kind of control these, but at the same time, it's usually the states that carry them out. Governors also have the ability to be able to fill vacancies in Congress, to decide, particularly with the House of Representatives, when there's going to be special elections. Perhaps somebody passes away, somebody resigns, somebody moves on to a new office or whatever. The governor has the ability to be able to call for a special election. And also, interestingly enough, in the United States Senate, the governor has the ability to be able to appoint a person to the U.S. Senate should somebody, for example, again, pass away. Say there's a new presidential administration and somebody leaves to go into the president's cabinet. The governor can appoint a person to hold that seat until the next election comes along. It's a lot of power for the governor, and they obviously play politics with that. And then finally, the very Constitution itself is in many ways, shape, and form, influenced by the states themselves. So while it takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress to pass a constitutional amendment or change, it then requires 3/4, 75% of the state legislatures to pass a constitutional amendment. So the threshold is very high, and states have a very important role in passing constitutional amendments. Right? So those are some of the obligations back and forth between the national governments and the states. Now, when we talk about that 10th Amendment, those things that are generally reserved to the states, things that aren't in Article 1, Section 8, there are 3 basic things that we talk about in relationship to state powers. One is the police power. And basically, this is the ability to be able to engage in public safety, whether it's either, the police power, as we call it, the ability to public safety, whether it's the ability to be able to deal with problems of health, morals, which includes things like prostitution, and welfare laws and public conveniences, meaning where we can come, where we can go, zoning laws, things like that. That's, for example, why during COVID-19, most of the regulations that are being enacted are by the state governments and applied onto their local governments as well, because it's the police power, the power to be able to make laws or make executive orders on behalf of public health. We also have a lot of public services which traditionally have been left to the states. So schools, we mentioned kind of the criminal justice system and public protection, welfare services, health services, usually run by your county. Transportation is predominantly something that's done by the state and local levels. And then agriculture and conservation, which is now kind of a shared service between the federal government and states, but is kind of typically reserved to the states. And then finally, the power over regulating local governments is, in essence, part and parcel of what the federal government does not have the ability to be able to do, but only states do. So if you take a look at a state constitution, you'll see that there's a whole section that lays out, in addition to the state codes, how local governments can operate, how they're going to elect their officials, how much, what types of taxes they can use, what policies they're allowed to do, right? So those are the powers generally under the 10th Amendment that are reserved to the states. Now, here's one of the things. We know from looking at that the federal government's involved in a lot more things than we just saw that's only allowed in Article 1, Section 8, right? So if we take a look, there are sources of federal power that allow them to expand beyond the powers in Article 1, Section 8. And let's take a look at those powers again as they're laid out in a couple of various sections here. So we have, back up here to Article 1, Section 8, a couple of important things here for us. One is, you see in the very first clause there, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. It's called the General Welfare Clause of the United States. In essence, depending on who you talk to, right? There are people who very strictly believe that that General Welfare Clause only applies to the 18 things that you see here in Article 1, Section 8. But through most of history, American history, it's also been used to expand the powers of the federal government in order to be able to provide for the general welfare. Another thing that we see, and we'll talk about as we go through some of the history of American federalism here, is that if you take a look at the third thing on the list here, under Article 1, Section 8, it says to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So interstate commerce is something that's very important to the federal government's powers. And when we look at that, what we ultimately see is that it allows things like the Civil Rights Act, things like the end of desegregation and so forth to occur in the United States because of the power of regulating commerce. So that's expand the powers as well. And then finally, if we go down, hopefully I can correctly find this. Is the sorry about this. The Supremacy Clause in Article 6, which essentially says that no law in the United States can supersede the U.S. Constitution, essentially meaning that state laws, if they come into conflict with a national law, are going to be rejected in favor of the national law, provided that the national laws are actually constitutional. So if it's an unconstitutional national law, then the state law is supreme. But for the most part, federal government law trumps state government law because of the Supremacy Clause, which allows them, in essence, to be able to expand their power. Now, there's one thing that we left out, and something that's not, talked about in the original federal Constitution, is the idea that the federal government has an enormous taxing power, right? They have the ability to be able to tax the entire country and the entire tax base of the entire country. And also, in some cases, if you think about tariffs and various other things, they have the ability to be able to tax goods coming into the country. So one of the key sources of leverage for the federal government in order to be able to carry out things that aren't necessarily listed in the Constitution is the ability to be able to tax and redistribute that money to the states. One of the biggest sources of revenue, obviously, is the federal income tax, which was passed with the 16th Amendment to the Constitution back in the early 1900s. This then gave the federal government an enormous amount of money to give to the states to help them to do programs. Supposedly it's all voluntary and the states take it. They don't have to take it if they don't want to, but states are ready to take money anytime it's free so that they can accomplish goals for their citizens. So, that little carrot, hey, we'd like you to do this. Here's the cash. Okay, I'll do it. States come along, and that's a huge source of federal power. Now, the one last thing I'd like to talk about, as we see here, is the notion of how does the federal government pass this money along to states? And we'll see a little bit more about this at different points in time. But there are three primary tools that the federal government uses in order to be able to shake the carrot in front of the states. One, which isn't generally used, but it's been used a couple times in American history, is what we call just general revenue sharing. The federal government says to the states, hey, either we got a surplus or we need to help you out. We're just going to give a lump sum of cash and you spend it however you see fit. We saw this happen in 1836, saw it happen in 1972 with the General Revenue Sharing Program. This doesn't prove to be very popular, right? Because the number one goal of all members of Congress is to get reelected. And if I'm giving out free money to states and not saying what it should be used for, I can't credit claim, right? Oh, I was responsible for revenue sharing that gave, $100 million to the state of Delaware, and the governor used it to get himself reelected, right? That doesn't help me. So we don't see that very often in American history. The two other sources of funding that states get from the federal government are what we call block grants and categorical grants. Now, a block grant states love, right? I mean, general revenue sharing is great, money without any strings attached. But block grants are pretty good because essentially what the federal government does is say, hey, you know what, let's provide funding in one issue area. So for example, community development block grants. You want to have economic development at various levels in different cities and small towns across your state. The federal government gives that money to the states. They decide what programs they want to spend that money on, and it's good for the states. And the federal government's passing along money with no strings other than say, use this for community development. Categorical grants, on the other hand, are things that Congress likes to use because they can narrowly tailor where the money's going to be spent. So by its very definition, it's a category, very specific. So, what we might see is that a categorical grant, instead of maybe just being for education, might be for example, after school programs in disadvantaged neighborhoods in the country, right? So very specific purpose for that. Congress can accomplish whatever specific goals it wants to as a consequence of that. And that leaves very little wiggle room for the states, to spend the money on other things. Now, one of the interesting things about all this is that all of these grants need to be divided up somehow. And, Congress spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year on various programs. They have to determine how to spend that money. And that's oftentimes a point of contention between the states. So to give you an example in the area of transportation, states out west have a lot of roads vis-a-vis their per capita population. And they argue that we should spend more money on roads and our transportation funding formulas should reflect that. Now, you get into northeastern states like New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland that have, pretty vast mass transit systems. And they make the argument you can't just spend transportation funding on roads. You've got to allocate money towards mass transit. But Wyoming says no, because we don't have subway systems like you do in New York City or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., that sort of thing. Right. So these formulas are always a fight and an interesting battle between different, congressional legislation, congressional delegations within Congress. This is a general overview then of the powers that the federal government has, powers that state governments has, the powers, the responsibilities they have to each other, and then how the federal government has kind of become this prime partner in American federalism by using some various tools.